Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pelley, and thanks for being with us. Okay, before we get into our episode today, we're making an effort to better serve you, the listener, this year. If you have any feedback for our team or ideas you'd like us to tackle on the show, send us an email at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org. We'd really appreciate it, and if you do, hey, you just might win a special prize. So on today's episode, we're going to be taking a closer look at the ballot measures landscape in Wisconsin. Earlier this year, Democratic Governor Tony Evers proposed the idea of giving citizens a direct say in whether to amend state law or Wisconsin's constitution through the citizen initiative process. Wisconsin is one of 24 states that does not provide for the citizen initiative at this time, and the state has not added the initiative process, well, in quite a few decades. So the fact that Evers is mulling the idea is pretty noteworthy. So we thought the news provided a great opportunity for us to talk through the latest Wisconsin ballot measure world news and talk a little bit about the history of ballot measures in Wisconsin, which our team just recently finished compiling. So I'm joined now by Ryan Byrne, our expert on ballot measures, and we're going to walk through all of that. Ryan, thanks as always for coming on the show.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me.
All right. So give our listeners a little more context. It's very unlikely that we'll see any movement in the short term to establish a 27th state with access initiatives. Why is that?
In the short term, so like this legislative session, we definitely won't see an initiative and referendum proposal come out of Wisconsin. The governor's a Democrat. As you noted, he's calling for constitutional amendment, but the legislature is Republican controlled. So obviously there are party conflicts at play. I don't know his political development very well. I know in Wisconsin, there's lots of love for former Governor Bob La Follette, also known as Fighting Bob, and he was a big advocate for the initiative and referendum process. But maybe rather than focusing on the governor's philosophical position, we can also kind of think about it in terms of political strategy. While Wisconsin has been pretty competitive in statewide elections, Democrats haven't controlled a single legislative chamber since 2010. So in other words, Democrats have not been able to pass a legislative agenda in Wisconsin. So with the ballot initiative, Democrats or progressive groups could petition legislation onto the ballot for voters to decide. It's something we see across the country in Republican-controlled states with the initiative process, but also, something we do see with conservatives in some Democratic-controlled states as well, especially in recent years like Colorado and Washington. So with a divided government, it's not very likely that the legislature would probably move on the governor's proposal.
When was the last time a state added the citizen initiative?
Yeah, so that was actually in 1996 in Mississippi, and we could go down a rabbit hole with Mississippi. They voted on it several times. The court struck it down once. They voted on it again, and now the process is kind of suspended again to a court ruling. But yeah, it was 1996.
That's a really fun and complicated story for another episode. So what about before Mississippi? Since technically, let's not count Mississippi because they don't actually have it right now. So when was the last state to add the initiative before Mississippi?
That's a good question, too. It's another state that's kind of a little odd. It would be like Illinois in 1970, but the Illinois initiative process is restricted to a single subject about the structure of the state legislature. So Illinois is another one where it's like kind of weird. So it would probably be Florida, 1968, when they adopted a process for initiated constitutional amendments and veto referendum. So that, of course, came through not a specific question about a ballot measure or establishing that process, but in terms of ratifying a whole new state constitution.
Wow. So, okay. Yeah, it's been quite a long time then since a state has added the initiative process to its voters. Some states have tried to add it and have rejected it over the years. Wisconsin's one of those states, right?
Right. Wisconsin is indeed one of those states all the way back from 1914.
And how many states like Wisconsin tried and failed to establish the initiative process?
I think most of them actually ended up voting on it again. So the ones where it failed once, it eventually passed. But I think it's some states that people would be a bit surprised about, like Rhode Island in 1986.
Yeah.
Minnesota voted on it 3 times. Texas is another one. And then Mississippi, Wyoming, and Missouri all rejected it once, but they eventually approved it in later years.
Right. Why was the Wisconsin initiative amendment in 1914, why was that unpopular at the time? Is there more to that story?
Yeah, right. It's kind of surprising. I mentioned the fall a little bit earlier. Wisconsin was kind of seen as this hotbed for the progressive movement of the time, yet they rejected the initiative and referendum amendment. In fact, they rejected everything in 1914. So voters actually faced 10 constitutional amendments in 1914, which is a really high number, especially for Wisconsin, even over a century ago. Progressive Republicans had been in power for more than a decade and had enacted several reforms, including significant tax increases the previous year, which, from my understanding, weren't particularly popular with voters. And political parties have factions. They still have factions today. We talk about those from time to time. But I would say even more so in the early 1900s, both Republicans and Democrats had like conservative and progressive wings to the parties. So the Wisconsin Republican Party actually came out against all 10 amendments, despite a Republican controlled legislature putting them on a ballot. So this movement developed to really advocate for a blanket no vote, no on all 10 amendments. And it seemed to work because none of them received more than 38% of the vote. And just one more thing, some of these rejected amendments would appear on the ballot again years later. Wisconsin's also famous for its recall, perhaps has one of the most famous gubernatorial recalls in recent years. It was rejected in 1914, but 10 years later, again, voters approved it. But an amendment for the initiative and referendum never appeared on the ballot again.
One of the things that listeners can see if they come to Ballotpedia to read the articles about the historical ballot measures is just how much of a sort of down stretch we're in over the grand scheme of the last 150 years for the volume of ballot measures. And you can see that so clearly in the bar charts that we're producing. And obviously, you can't see them in this episode, but we're in a stretch where there are far fewer ballot measures than there were over the previous decades, in particular at the beginning of the 20th century. We're talking about ballot measures in Wisconsin right now, in particular because they have one on the ballot in a few weeks. Voter ID is on the ballot on April 1st in a legislatively referred constitutional amendment. So, Ryan, tell us a little bit about this ballot measure. Why is it appearing in the first place? Because Wisconsin already has a voter ID requirement, right?
That might confuse people, especially maybe people outside Wisconsin who haven't, been paying attention to the political debates happening there. So why would someone want to put a policy in the state constitution that's already on the books, right? So there's really two reasons, and we see this play out with policies across the country with constitutional amendments. So the first one's legislative repeal. If it's in the Constitution, it cannot be repealed easily. In Wisconsin, it takes two legislative sessions with an election in between. So for the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment, and then voters need to approve it. So, let's say maybe Democrats don't like the voter ID statute as much. If they gain control of the legislature, they could pass a bill to repeal it. It would take two sessions though, so Republicans could gain the legislature back, or voters could reject the proposal. So just when something's in the Constitution, it's harder to get rid of. The second one, and this is actually the one where we see a lot of arguments from supporters of the amendment, that's court rulings. So right now, voter ID is state statute. The Wisconsin Supreme Court could, in theory, find that the voter ID law violates a provision of the state constitution. However, if voter ID is added to the Constitution, then it's, by definition constitutional, at least in terms of the state constitution.
And have we seen any other states that have done a similar constitutional amendment related to voter ID?
Yeah, we have. So they can come as we've been kind of discussing, right? They can be either statutory or constitutional. We've seen ballot measures for both. I do think when you look at the patterns, and if we were just to base Wisconsin, relative to other states, these things do tend to pass. So last year, actually, just this past November, a voter ID constitutional amendment received more than 70% of the vote in Nevada. And 65% in Nebraska. A couple years ago, voters in Arizona did narrowly reject a ballot measure to expand voter ID requirements to mail in voting and kind of restricting the alternative IDs that can be used for in person voting. Of course, Arizona already had a voter ID requirement, though. That was just to expand it. So it's actually the last time, and really the only time, that voters ever rejected a new voter ID requirement ballot measure was Wisconsin's neighbor, Minnesota, in 2012. So, like I said, just based on other ballot measures, I think it will be more notable if this one loses.
Yeah, okay. So not the first of its kind. Okay, so and you kind of alluded to this earlier. We've seen an uptick in Wisconsin ballot measures in recent years, referred from the legislature, because you have this dynamic in state government where the governor is one party, in this case, the Democrat, and the legislature is the other party, in this case, Republican. Putting measures on the ballot does not require the governor's signature, So when there's division between, say, the government and the legislature, oftentimes the legislature, they want to try to put a policy forward. In these dynamics, they're going to put it to voters through a ballot measure. What are some other states that have seen this in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, right? It's a really interesting dynamic because I think when people think about bills and legislation, you think you would want to try like a trifecta, right? When one party controls both legislative chambers and the governor's office would result in more partisan bills. And right, I think that probably that tends to be the case. But with constitutional amendments, it's a little bit different because, like you said, they don't require the governor's signature. So that's a really interesting arrangement that tends to lead to more constitutional amendments because the governor can't veto constitutional amendments. I'm based in Pennsylvania, so this is, something that I'm aware of. It started to really play out in Pennsylvania as well, and then it stopped. And why did it stop? Democrats took control of the state house in 2022.
Hmm.
But for a while before then, we saw that kind of conflict unfolding. And I think one state where we really see it playing out right now is Arizona, where the governor's a Democrat and Republicans control the legislature. And it's a little bit easier to put non constitutional amendments on the ballot by the legislature as well there. And those don't require the governor's signature either in Arizona when you're putting them on the ballot. So, yeah, we just totally see Arizona, tons of legislative ballot measures last year. And it looks like with how the session is going so far, that's probably going to happen again.
Our historical ballot measures fact book, which is these new products we're putting out, these new articles, comprehensive research into a particular state's ballot measure landscape. And we're really proud of them. Putting it together, no small task, a lot of digging through newspaper archives and weird PDFs of election results. And they highlight some of our most interesting findings from looking at 178 years of Wisconsin ballot measure history. So, talk us through some of the ones that stood out to you, Ryan. What was interesting when you dig in there?
Yeah, right. That's 257 ballot measures since Wisconsin became a state. There's so many interesting ones, and you can just kind of see like the slow growth in like the current structures, whether it's the legislature or the governor's office, the governor's veto powers, things like that grow over time. But I'll point out two in particular that I think are pretty interesting. One of them's a pretty big thing that we see play out across a number of states, which is suffrage, and another one is a smaller thing, but I'll say why it's
Hmm.
quite notable, and that's school buses. So to start with the big one, suffrage. So this pattern occurred in many states where suffrage for black persons and women was actually first decided through state ballot measures. We know a lot about how it played out at the federal level, but there were a lot of state ballot measures involved in these changes. So in Wisconsin, black male suffrage was introduced first. Took a few attempts, which you could probably just understand why. Mid 1800s, and only white men could vote. Later on, with women's suffrage on the ballot, only men could vote. So you could understand why these took a few times. So black male suffrage was actually approved in 1849, but it did take till 1866 for the courts to enforce it. And then with women's suffrage, it's kind of interesting because in 1886, the first time this was on the ballot, voters, who again were all men, did approve it because it only expanded women's suffrage to school issues, school boards, school ballot measures, things like that. When it actually a ballot measure came up in 1912 for full suffrage for women, 63% of those men voted against it. So it wasn't until the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that women in Wisconsin could vote. And then, kind of maybe something that might seem like a smaller thing, school buses and student absences, but I think it relates to debates we still have. So, the Wisconsin Constitution includes a few provisions regarding restrictions on religious instruction in public or publicly funded education. So, all the way back in 1947, the legislature, had this provision, but they wanted to allow publicly funded transportation to private schools, in other words, school buses. Voters shot it down. The question came back 20 years later in 1967. So, that debate was going on for over 20 years, allowing publicly funded school buses for private schools. And voters did approve it in 1967. And voters were also asked in 1972 whether public schools can, release students during school hours to receive religious instruction elsewhere. In other words, excused absences. Voters approved that one by less than 1%. So, although these questions aren't necessarily these big ballot measures, they reflect broader debates that we still have today between public funding for non-public education and between parents and schools and kind of what that dynamic looks like. So, the Wisconsin Constitution, like all state constitutions, minus Delaware, that belongs a whole nother podcast episode. All state constitutions are really a product of ballot measures over time.
Too true. That's how those states amend those constitutions. So in Wisconsin, the busing item you're bringing up, is that still legal? Is that on the books that the public buses can go toward private schools, or did that get rejected in courts later or changed?
I mentioned that there were two ballot measures, right? 1947 and 1967. So they did approve it in 1967, but it is still in the books. Like you can go to the Wisconsin Constitution and there's like a specific provision that says like we can provide public funding for school buses to private and religious schools. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. Going through state constitutions, you always see these provisions. You're like, that is so particular and weird. It's like, well, in 1967, it was an issue, right? So, it's fun to go through state constitutions and all those provisions relate back to a ballot measure at some point.
Yeah, I live in South Carolina, and there's something about courthouse steps and Sundays and fried chicken, and we won't go into it. But every state constitution has all sorts of interesting quirks, and well, maybe there's a whole nother episode there, Ryan. So we'll have to have you on to talk more about other historical ballot measures in the coming weeks and months ahead. Maybe we'll even talk about Starbase sometime in April. So if you're curious what that means, listeners, stay tuned, and we'll tell you all about the ballot measure about Starbase in a few months. So Ryan, good to see you today.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our historical ballot measure fact books at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with more on the ballot. And hey, before I let you go, if you've made it this far into the show, thanks for listening. We're making an effort to better serve you, the listener. If you have any feedback for our team or ideas you'd like us to tackle, don't hesitate to send us an email at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks again for listening.